Hello, everyone. I'm Daz, and welcome to American Civil War and UK History podcast. This presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel or as a podcast from wherever you get your podcasts from. And if you're watching on YouTube, remember to hit the subscribe button and give us a big thumbs up. And check out our website at www.acwandukhistory.com. And for updates, blog posts, and links to all of our social media pages, and also the link is available in the podcast description. And joining me again today is historian of Rooted in Place, Madeline Feierstein. Welcome, Madeline.
Thanks for having me again.
So this is the third episode in a series of podcasts dedicated to Alexandria during the American Civil War, and it's called Alexandria at War. And in this episode, we're going to be discussing hospitals. Why did Alexandria become the hospital centre, Madeline?
So, as we've discussed in some previous episodes, Alexandria being the first Confederate city to be captured in the war. Also, we had the industries confiscated, the rail lines, the wharfs. It was on the literal border of the Union and the Confederacy. 25 forts established to protect Washington, D.C. It becomes a military base overnight. Now, we're seeing, especially in the first 2 years of the war, a lot of soldiers are deployed from Alexandria. They're going to go into the Virginia battlefields. They're going to go down the rail lines into rural Virginia. They're going to go into further battles down into the Western Theater from Alexandria. They're going to arrive in Alexandria from the battlefields too. So it started off as a place to ship your soldiers and ship your supplies out to the battlefields, but it also had a return effect. Alexandria is going to start receiving a lot more than just information and communications and surveillance and intelligence. Alexandria unintentionally will become a city of hospitals. Now, we don't see many examples of urban centers like Alexandria becoming massive hospital centers. Baltimore and Philadelphia, of course, become a big center for medicine and convalescence. But Alexandria is quite unique because it is quite on the front lines. These are not field hospitals, these are general hospitals. So it is, again, on the border of the Union and Confederacy, and it's going to be a triage center. It's going to be a site where soldiers are going to convalesce for months on end. And it's going to be where we also send soldiers further up north or back home for a continued medical treatment or discharge, essentially. So it becomes a hospital center due to just the high level of activity in the city already. But when it was captured, it was not intended to become the major medical center that it did. And we're going to discuss in today's episode specific cases of hospitals and also major medical feats that occur within the city walls.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, so explain the organisation of the hospitals within the city, please.
Yes, we have a great map that's been provided for us by Historic Alexandria. You can get it on their website at alexandria.gov. What makes Alexandria also a little different, because it wouldn't be an episode about Alexandria without explaining how unique and different it is. These hospitals are organized into neighborhoods. That's the best way we can describe it. They're divided into three different divisions. Okay, so we have one, two, and three, first, second, and third divisions. When Alexandria was confiscated, there was only one hospital, essentially, in the city. And then in 1862, we're going to see an explosion of hospitals. There is going to be such a need after Antietam that not only are over 15 hospitals going to be established, they're going to split into the divisional system. And what we mean by this is that there's going to be a head surgeon assigned to each division, and then a set number of assistant surgeons also assigned. So let's take the first division, for example. You have a head surgeon and maybe 6, 10, 15 assistant surgeons who would float among the 5 to 8 hospitals. This was a way to kind of mitigate staff to patient ratios and to also make sure that these surgeons aren't running around the city with their heads cut off, essentially. It creates some order within a very condensed area. Over 30 hospitals are going to be established essentially in a 4 year period. Some hospitals stay from the beginning. They're big general hospitals, and then we're going to see smaller ones branch off like little smaller campuses. And I'll give you some examples throughout the episode. Now in DC, in the capital, It was different since they followed the brigade system, which initially tied a hospital to a fort, right? So the fort was like the headquarters, and then you would have a hospital system tied to the barrack or the fort. That's not what's happening here, which is quite interesting considering that Alexandria has 25 forts. The difference is the forts are nowhere near the city center. So on the map, you see everything's very condensed, right? If you walk down Washington Street or King Street, the big major thoroughfares in Alexandria, you're going to pass by five in one block. There are so many right next to each other. But the forts, they're a couple miles out. So the brigade system would never have worked. That would leave the hospitals much farther away from the wharf than they intended. So that's why a lot of these hospitals are established in neighborhoods. And that created this division system.
So who was in charge of these hospitals?
Yes, and we luckily have three amazing photos of the same man. He is one of my Civil War heroes, someone who is extremely underrated in the history of the war and should be discussed more. I hope to write a book about him in the near future. This is Dr. Edwin Bentley, Major Bentley. Now, like I said earlier, each division had a head surgeon. And Dr. Bentley first started off as the head surgeon for the third division, which had the smallest amount of hospitals, about 5 to 6 at any given point. Now, the organization of Alexandria, the person totally in charge, though, of everything was the Department of Washington's medical director, who was Robert Osborne Abbott for the majority of the time. So all of the head surgeons in the divisions, all the assistant surgeons would report back to the larger Department of Washington. But Bentley rose up in the ranks, and he ended up becoming the superintendent of all 30 military hospitals, the medical care of prisoners within the city, and the overseer of contraband medical care for the enslaved people who fled into Alexandria. We discussed them last episode. So his story is quite interesting. I do want to spotlight it because it does speak volumes as to his trajectory during the war. He actually enlisted in the army in June of 1861. He's one of the few surgeons who, by trade, chose to become part of the army and didn't just volunteer their services. And he enlisted with the 1st Connecticut Heavy Artillery, and he was the regimental surgeon. So he received the rank of major right off the bat. In June of 1862, he's captured at the Battle of Gaines Mill outside of Richmond, and he is sent to the infamous Libby Prison in Richmond. He's there for about 3 months. Surgeons were a hot commodity to capture, as we know. While imprisoned, he was ordered to treat all the prisoners. And then he was exchanged later for several Confederate privates, before, of course, the exchange system was halted. So after he's released, he's a little ambivalent to go back to the battlefield. I mean, we can all completely understand that. He had been captured while attending soldiers on the battlefield, stuck in this heinous prison. He just wants to go to a more administrative role. And now, in his service file at the National Archives in DC, you can find so many letters of recommendation. He is writing everybody he knows to try to get him a position in Washington. He wants to help out. He's extremely determined, very innovative, a little bit wily this way, though, because he is trying to scrape his way up. But Dr. Bentley will prove himself. So, like I said, he first starts off as the head surgeon for the third division. So he's in charge of about 5 to 6 hospitals. And then by next summer in 1863, he's going to get promoted to be the superintendent of all of these hospitals. And that's a really great feat because by the summer of 1863, we're now nearing 25 hospitals. We had started off with one at the beginning of the war. And then on September 20th, 1862, the city splits into the three divisional system because Alexandria started to receive an immense amount of casualties from Antietam, and they were not prepared for this. Bentley is remembered as a very kind and diligent surgeon. He's one of those rare folks back then who kind of was a quack doctor, but he really did want to treat people and wasn't interested in just shuttling them back onto the battlefield. He was a private surgeon in Connecticut. He did treat, had like a family practice, a private practice. He was very interested in surgery and kind of innovative techniques. A little bit of an oddball because he was known for shipping body parts back to his home office in Connecticut. So his wife, who's hanging out back at their Connecticut residence, is receiving shipments of amputated limbs that he has sawed off, and because he will later go on to dissect them and experiment with them. But again, that just shows his innovative curiosity. His patients and staff, towards the end of the war, banded together to gift him a gold watch, actually, because he was such a nice guy. And that, again, speaks volumes to his character. His first wife actually died in February of 1865 while he was in Alexandria. And then after the war, he went on to teach at Howard University's medical school. This was a very famous school, the first one available to African Americans after the war. And many white Civil War surgeons were the first professors to help educate African Americans in medicine. And then he met his second wife, who is from DC. They married in 1868. Um, Now, he had two daughters from his first marriage and one son, but only one of those children will outlive him, his daughter. What's really cool is after the Civil War, he has a very storied history. He'll go and fight in the Black Hills during the Indian Wars. He'll go out to California and actually examine the psychiatric facilities out there. Famously, Alcatraz, before it became Alcatraz, it was a psychiatric center. So he will go survey it on behalf of the US Army. Then he will go found the University of Arkansas's medical school. And unfortunately, in 1917, at the age of 93, he will go onto his roof to do who knows what, and he falls off the ladder. And that's how he dies. Unfortunately, very tragic and just kind of a sad way for him to die, considering he had such a storied career. And he's buried at Arlington National Cemetery. He chose to come back to the DC region for his burial, and he had a lot of options in terms of where he was buried. His wife was in Connecticut. He had a son in California. Of course, his second wife is still in Little Rock, Arkansas, but he chose to come back here. So he's a very interesting figure, and we're going to get more into his role here. But he is legitimately the man who is running all these hospitals, and he has jurisdiction over the prisoners as well. Our next episode is on the prison, so he'll come back into play when we talk about that. But he has a lot on his plate. So that is Dr. Edwin Bentley.
Nice. Yeah, can I ask about the people that are involved within the hospital scene
Yes,
itself? So,
yes.
so we're talking about the nurses and the people
Hmm.
that volunteer. So are most of these people volunteers, or is it a paid role, or
Yeah,
how did that work at the
that's a
time?
great question. Luckily, I've seen hundreds of examples of nurses who are on the muster roll. They are paid by the US Army. Now, of course, we have volunteers, but there are hundreds of female nurses who were essentially employees of the Army. And they were being deployed into Alexandria by Dorothea Dix herself. Again, because of Alexandria's location being next to DC, Lincoln is very involved and very interested in the hospital centers and how it's all organized. DC and Alexandria are kind of working side by side. And again, they're all part of the Department of Washington, along with Point Lookout in Maryland. So we're seeing a combination of volunteer nurses, enlisted, for lack of better words, enlisted nurses. We also have a large amount of veteran reserve corps. A lot of soldiers who were treated in Alexandria and DC's hospitals would stay on and help out in the war effort, but they were too ill or disabled to go back to the front lines. Maybe they have a persistent cough or they injured themselves and they can't march or they can't hold a rifle, whatever the situation was. But they were fit enough to be on guard duty or be clerks or nurses. So I've seen many examples of soldiers who were treated in Alexandria's hospitals who then were assigned to that hospital or to the next division's hospital. The VRC are going to be extremely helpful in mitigating this explosion of patients flooding into Alexandria. The assistant surgeons are so critical. There's many of them. In one hospital, there's going to be between 6 and 15, maybe more in some of the larger general ones. Many of these hospitals are, and I can actually get into this with our next slide. Many of these hospitals are quite small compared to what we're seeing in other cities. Um, I think that even if we have a capacity of like 150, you're still going to have about six assistant surgeons in there. It's a massive operation. And that's something I appreciate about Alexandria's hospitals. Just because the capacity of your population treated is just quite small, it's a relatively small amount, they're still given full attention. They're not going to say, oh, just 100 guys there, whatever, send two doctors. They're still going to send the same amount of people and give them the same amount of attention. Yeah, so that's what I'll say about the staff makeup.
Okay. Yeah.
Hmm.
Um, Yeah, so how were hospitals created? Explain the role
Mm.
of the confiscation, and was every hospital confiscated private home, say for instance?
Yeah, and I've included so many examples. There's amazing photos we have of these hospitals. I'm going to start by saying that many of the hospitals have been demolished, but so many of them remain. And a lot of them have been modified. A lot of them have been, renovated into private residences or businesses or just, renovated beyond repair, beyond recognition. But there are many of them you can still visit today. Now, you can't go in a lot of them because they're private residences. And the one on the screen right now, Wolf Street Hospital, is a great example. This was the residence of Francis Smith, who was Robert E. Lee's lawyer after the war, especially when he was potentially tried for treason or not, right? And it looks exactly as it does today. It is still a private residence. And you can see here from this wartime image, the capacity was 100. Fun fact, though, this still is today the largest home in Alexandria. There's not much land. Homes don't have a lot of yardage. There's no big sprawling front yards. It's an urban city. And this is still to this day the largest home. But it only received 100 patients, despite it being a giant mansion. Like I mentioned in previous episodes, about two-thirds of the residents had fled. Now, many expected to return in a short period of time, um, but the main issue was tax payment, and this is how the union got them. In order to pay property taxes in Alexandria, you have to come pay in person. However, um, you need to take the oath of loyalty, as we discussed last episode, in order to be in the city. So if you're a secessionist citizen and you go to Dixie and you realize, oh shoot, my tax payment's due, you can't just come back or send somebody on your behalf um, and then go back to Richmond. It doesn't work that way. So many citizens did not pay their taxes, or they tried to pay from the Confederacy, or they tried using Confederate money, many other examples here. And then the tax payment was denied or invalid. So the property itself was confiscated by the government. Now remember, we don't have a civil government anymore. The military government has issued martial law. We don't have civil courts. We have military court. We have a military governor, provost marshal. We will have a mayor reelected in 1863, Lewis Mackenzie, but he has essentially no power. So it's not just the government taking your property, it is the military government. And while they have it, they're going to likely transform it into offices, a prison, or a hospital. So this is why so many private homes and businesses became hospitals. And on the screen, we have another extremely famous example. This is the Mansion House Hospital, made famous by PBS series Mercy Street. Now, this building no longer exists. It was demolished in the 1960s, along with a whole bunch of other unfortunate historic properties in Alexandria. It was a hotel, and it had the largest capacity of any hospital. Now, I hear conflicting reports. Some say 500 beds, some say 700, some say they treated up to 900, even though there were no beds. We're going to measure it out at around 700 beds comfortably. And this was a confiscated property because the owner, James Green, who lived in the Carlisle House, one of our oldest homes in Alexandria, situated just behind the mansion house, he refused to take the oath of loyalty to remain in Alexandria. And so they said, all right, Mr. Green, you got to take the oath or else you can't operate your business here in the city. He didn't do it. And so they took his furniture factory, which we'll talk about next episode on prisons, and they took his hotel. So again, this is a very famous one. Physically, the largest building, largest business. So Wolf Street before was the largest home, and then this is the largest business. The next slide, I have a picture of what's called the Hollowell Hospital, Old Hollowell. And I just find this to be such a great picture. You can see the soldiers out front. You can see a ladder up to the roof. Um, Benjamin Hollowell was an educator. He was a teacher. He famously taught a lot of elite Alexandrians like Robert E. Lee. He had an academy in Alexandria. Now, his house and his school were confiscated at the same time. His business here, his school was Old Hollowell, and then his house across the street became New Hollowell.
Hmm.
This building, though, the one we're looking at now, was the first hospital to be confiscated. So we had one hospital kind of in the city in 1861 to treat people, but this was the first one that the army actually took. So it's a great example. It's also just a really cool image. Yeah. Now, this example, I think you're going to love this picture. Now, let's break down what's going on here. In the front building, the spiky tower one, this is Tuscan Villa. It no longer stands, but right behind it is Wolf Street Hospital, the biggest one. And you can see a woman out in front, and she is likely a contraband individual, or she's formerly enslaved within Alexandria itself. She's carrying like what seems to be a laundry basket. Now, Tuscan Villa is gorgeous, and I'm so sad it was demolished. Great example of around 1840s Italianate style. But again, Tuscan Villa and Wolf Street are huge, but they didn't treat a lot of people. Again, max 100, 150 soldiers at any given point. Um, but these were private residences that are good examples of large facilities taken. And then, yeah, that's the only other one I have for that question.
Okay, yeah,
Uh-huh.
excellent. But no, some attractive buildings. It's just a shame that they're
Yes.
not. Some of them are not there anymore.
Oh, I know.
Because this
Terrible.
is a beautiful example of that.
Mm.
Um, yeah, so the next question is going to be, detail the extraordinary feat of the first successful blood transfusion of the American Civil War,
Yes. So,
um, which occurred in Alexandrian Hospital as well. So that's pretty cool.
yes, this is what I teased earlier when talking about Dr. Bentley is he will not only just manage, of course, all of these buildings and all the people, he will continue to innovate, continue to invent, and continue to challenge the medical norm. But I want to address the picture on the screen. This is the site where the first successful blood transfusion of the war occurred. And I had the privilege last April in 2025 to partner with the US Army in having a name reading and a dedication of the site. We placed the sign. This was the Grosvenor Branch Hospital. And next to me is my good friend Brent Reidenbach, who is a descendant of a man who died in the hospital during the war. His ancestor, Martin Swick, passed away in May of 1864. And we've been able to trace Martin's story to the hospital. Brent had contacted me a couple of years ago, um, confirming that this was the site. It's a modern museum now. You can actually go in and see it, which is pretty cool. It's great that I was able to be at the site. I used to work at the site, and I want to use it as a way to talk about it. On the next slide, I have a picture of the quartermaster's map of the hospital itself. So you can see from the image before, where there's the port, and then this kind of telescopic jutted outside there. Now, at the Grosvenor Branch Hospital in July of 1864, we get Private George Cross. He's from the 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery. He had been wounded 3 weeks earlier at the Battle of Petersburg, and he got shot in his right leg and right ankle. Okay. Now, it took him 3 weeks to get here. He's one of these examples of patients who are triaged on the field, then they're put on a cart, wagon, they're put on a hospital ship, or they're put on a rail line, and they're sent up to Alexandria for further treatment. Um, 3 weeks is a long time to have bullets in your leg and blood loss. So when he gets to Alexandria, he gets to Grosvenor Branch. Dr. Bentley said, well, I can't successfully operate on this leg. He's lost too much blood. In the 1860s, this was a very primitive practice, the blood transfusion. They had no idea what a blood type was, so most of the successes that had occurred before were just sheer luck. They didn't really get why some blood worked with other blood. Um, of course, they're not really aware of disease transference too. They're not aware of too much blood versus taking too little. It's a balancing act. So again, most of the successes before was just sheer luck. Dr. Bentley, though, he's very experimental, as we've seen with his shipment of the limbs back to his home office. He's going to use the hypodermic syringe, the Tiemann, I think that's pronounced Tiemann syringe, and he is going to try a blood transfusion in August of 1864. Now, according to his words in the medical record of the war, he took the blood from a strong, healthy German. So it's a German soldier or German heritage soldier who donated his blood. And he's going to infuse it into Private Cross that August. And it was deemed successful. Now, I'm going to put asterisks on this because at the same time in Philadelphia, another experimental blood transfusion occurred. The thing is Private Cross was deemed a successful transference in August, while the Philadelphia case was deemed successful in September or early October. In Philadelphia, they took longer to determine if the transference was a success or not, I guess based on whether that patient had convalesced or had recovered. But that August, Private Cross's right leg is amputated. He is going to remain in the hospital for about, a few more months until January. He is discharged, sent back home to Philadelphia. Private Cross, though, will only live a few more years. He will die in 1867, likely from the blood clot that formed at that amputation site. But Dr. Bentley extended his life. He was able to be buried in his family plot in in Massachusetts, and not at Alexandria National Cemetery. And it is officially the first successful blood transfusion of the Civil War. So that's pretty cool. And that happened here at one of our smaller hospitals, physically smaller and a little bit out of the way, and with a capacity of 150 soldiers.
Hmm. And
Hmm.
that's the thing about the American Civil War. There's a lot of innovations that happen with inside
Yes.
hospitals, isn't there? But
Yeah.
there's a well, I suppose it's not a misconception, but um, through my research, I found that from what I understand, they didn't really understand, sanitization
Yeah.
and keeping these hospitals and things clean. So, how clean were these hospitals, and did they actually understand that aspect of hospital care?
They tried their best. I mean, we can't. It's hard because we want to look through our 2025 eyes and just disparage it. But they did understand some semblance of cleanliness. They did understand this. I will say though, many of these residences, once the war was over, they didn't really clean them up very well. And I'm going to use this hospital on the screen as our example here, the Grosvenor Branch Hospital, because when the Union left this property around July of 1865. The family came back and found blood-soaked floors. The Union didn't clean it up. They weren't interested in obviously replacing those floors. The owners never filed with the Southern Claims Commission to uh, get any type of compensation, mainly because the family did not take the oath of allegiance, which meant they couldn't apply for federal compensation. But the fact is that the doctors just packed up and left. They weren't really worried about returning the home back to its original state. So the family, instead of replacing the floorboards, ripping them up, they actually just covered them with new set of floorboards, which would have been cheaper, especially on their post-war budget. And so if you go to this site, which is now a museum, you'll walk on the 1870s to around 1920s floors, but underneath there's going to be the original blood-soaked floors. So there's many examples of like the Mansion House Hospital. It was just packed up and left, and it was left kind of gross. So I would say rather than saying they were never clean, they just didn't do a good job of cleaning as they go, is how I want to say. It's like when we're cooking and you want to clean some of the dishes as you cook rather than leave all the dishes to the end. They left it all to the end. And it wasn't their job to maintain the property. Uh, no one was really thinking about the residents coming back. No one knew how this war would end. So many of these buildings, again, had to be renovated beyond recognition. A lot of them were completely knocked down because of the disgustingness left behind. Um, but we're seeing that, and I have another example because I'm full of them today. At this hospital, too, we have a soldier named Joseph Grant. He's a Canadian-born soldier, and he goes into the hospital for measles, but then he will contract typhoid in the Grosvenor Branch Hospital and die ultimately from typhoid fever, not measles. These cramped conditions, what they believed was miasma, bad air, the the pairing up of patients who were of different statuses, maybe one who was on his way to be remedied, to be cured, to be able to just convalesce for a few days, versus a soldier right next to him who's on death's doorstep, that kind of cross-contamination. This is where we see kind of these mess ups and these mistakes being made, but we can't judge them fully because how would they know?
No, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, how prevalent were diseases with inside the hospitals then?
Mhm. I would say, just like you'll in any city in the Civil War, you'll hear more about disease than wounds, and this is what we're seeing mainly in Alexandria. I would still the statistic, of course, is about 2/3 of all deaths were disease related, and I will say the same for Alexandria. We're seeing a lot of soldiers just perish from disease, and let's Let's remove the disease was the most common killer kind of out of the question right now. Let's take Alexandria's situation a little more uniquely. Remember, these are soldiers who are barracked here. They are stationed here for months on end and all weather. Last episode, we talked about the crime and like the boredom, right? And the fidgetiness and the criminality associated with being stuck in a city. But also, let's take into consideration they're all with each other and outside in barracks or in tents or stuck together in these confiscated homes. I have examples of staff who get sick, staff who contract these diseases. Many times they'll be sent to a completely different hospital. So they'll be like I had a hospital steward named Theodore Schuler who was stationed at the Delaney House Hospital in DC, but then he was sent to Grosvenor Branch across the river because I guess I just wanted to remove him from the environment that made him sick. So we have a very unique situation where it's not just soldiers who are marching together and in quarters together, they're spending significant amounts of time. You also have soldiers who are coming out of the battlefield. Maybe they've contracted some illness in the field, and then they're coming back to Alexandria for furlough or to receive new assignment, and then now they're bringing that disease into the city. It becomes a very ill city really quick because of that. There are, of course, gunshot wounds. Like I said, Alexandria became a dumping ground for many soldiers coming off the battlefield. We were often the first stop for soldiers immediately after the field hospital. And even as far away places as Gettysburg, there are soldiers who are going to matriculate and make their way down here in order to convalesce. Many soldiers were assessed for their fitness if they could be returned to duty from Alexandria, and if not, of course, they're discharged and sent home. So we're seeing mainly disease, but again, because of Alexandria's location, we're also going to see a large amount of gunshot wounds and the shell fracture wounds from battle because we were a major triage center.
Hmm. But again, like as well, those camps were full of all sorts of horrible things,
Oh
and
yeah.
yeah, like you said, coming into the city and but again, this is the Victorian period, and the
Yeah.
Victorian period is a very dirty period,
Yeah.
and even all the major cities had issues with all of these things, so
Yes.
it's but it's what I'd love to know is, so obviously with hospitals comes death
Hmm.
and also amputations and everything like that. So how did they deal with that amount of bodies after
Yeah.
their death,
Yes.
or what was the process for, making sure, obviously, because again, this is a Christian sort of,
Yes.
world at this
Right.
time as well. So respectfully, dealing with those dead bodies.
Yes. And I'm happy to get into this. We're going to talk about soldier burial again in the final episode when Alexandria kind of comes back to normal, but I'm happy to talk about this now too. Um, There are two things I want to comment on at this point. One is, and it may seem callous to say and very like disassociated from the event, but because all these hospitals were right next to each other, right? There'd be collection days. Every hospital was furnished with a dead house. It was a garden shed, essentially, that every property was provided because 9 times out of 10, this was not a property intended to be a medical center, and there was nowhere to put the dead. Especially as we get into the summer of 1864, hundreds are going to die every day across these 30 hospitals. So there'd be like a wagon, and it would go and collect the deceased. And it kind of reminds me of the Black Plague and how they would
Mhm.
have a bell and say, "Bring out your dead," and ring the
Yeah,
ring the
yeah.
bell. That's kind of how it was. And of course, it wasn't as announced in that way. But that was the easiest thing to do. The burial detail would just come door to door, and it may take you a while to get down to the farther away hospitals. For the ones like Camp Convalescent or the Sickle Barracks that are farther out in the city, the dead would be brought from those camps particularly. And the second thing I want to comment on is again what makes Alexandria just a little odd. This, of course, possibly happened in other cities, but speaking of that Victorian period, embalming, very taboo. You don't touch the body in the Victorian period. You actually put makeup on it, leave it as it is, right? Dress it all nice. Um, you don't want to desecrate what they call desecrate the corpse. So autopsies were not really a thing. Embalming was emergent. We'll see Lincoln's death and his embalming process to send his body back to Illinois. We'll kind of de-taboo it, destigmatize this. But many people were hesitant to touch the body. But in Alexandria, we had a couple of funeral homes, and this seems kind of just like sleazy, right? But these embalmers, these funeral directors would go hospital to hospital, bed to bed, handing out their business card, telling these dying soldiers, "Hey, for, $100, $75, I'll embalm you and send you back to your family. Just fill out the details and I'll be alerted upon your death." And this may seem like, again, a kind of like lucrative spoils of war, and it absolutely was. But for many soldiers, you got two options. You're going to be buried in Alexandria, which you have never heard of. Your family has no idea where this Alexandria, Virginia is, never heard of it. And you're going to be buried away from your family, or for a pretty penny, you'll be shipped home and your family can bury you with that same kind of Victorian values. And that became such a critical question for many soldiers. Now, most soldiers will not take up that offer. It is extremely expensive to ship your body back home, and let alone the embalming process. So most will not. But in Alexandria, we'll see that the soldier collective service, the burial detail, will become its own industry. And then we'll see that many soldiers will resort to things that are very against their values, but to preserve their body. Yeah, and we can get more into that in a later
Yeah,
episode.
that's
Hmm.
fascinating. It fascinates me
Yeah, oh, it is. It's
about
very
all of that.
interesting.
Yeah, and again, yeah, we'll get into that later on. But again, I needed to talk about it because it's so
Yes,
related to the topic that we're talking about. Okay,
absolutely.
so um, how was it decided which hospital a soldier would be sent to?
It's funny because I know people want a very direct answer for this, but there isn't. And the reason why I want to talk about this is to kind of address that we really just don't know. There wasn't a manual about which hospital to get sent to. Oftentimes, you're dropped off with your regiment. So many soldiers are shipped on hospital ship. This is actually how we're getting the most soldiers. They're going to be transported to the coastline of wherever they're fighting, and then they're going to be sent up, the Potomac River, or just like, for instance, even North Carolina. They're going to send people, especially the Virginia points, like City Point. But usually you go with your regiment. So when I'm looking at these hospital registers, I'm noticing that in the admissions, you'll see a whole group from like the 31st Maine just dumped all at once, or the 15th New York Heavy Artillery. There's a whole bunch of guys from there in one hospital. That wasn't the blueprint, but that was very common to be dropped off with your regiment. In my mind, this is how I want to view it. The hospital ship, the hospital rail car, the wagon arrives in the city. You're put on another wagon, and then you're just driven uptown, and you're driven up the street, and then you're deposited. Like, I almost want to imagine it. These surgeons come out of the hospital and say, "We got room for five, we got room for 10," almost like a vacancy in a hotel, because it's almost the randomness of it. We have very few hospitals in Alexandria that are specialty hospitals. And what I mean by specialty is there are some hospitals, like the Second Presbyterian Hospital, that specialized only in officers. Only officers could go there. But then way outside the city, you have Claremont, which was a smallpox hospital. So sometimes you'll be shipped to one place for one reason or another. But honestly, you're just gonna be dropped off where you fit. Now, at the wharf, we have the first and second division hospitals. In the third division, you're closer to the rail line. Okay. So a lot of those third division hospitals farther out in the city on the edge of town, they're near the major rail hub. And so they're going to receive specific types of soldiers, ones that probably came from those rural Virginian battlefields. And maybe in the first and second division, you're going to see casualties from farther away, right? So that's kind of like the system. It's kind of unorganized, but there was a little bit of method to their madness there. Hmm.
Excellent, fantastic answer. And did the contraband and USCT population receive medical treatment?
Yes, this has been it's such a storied topic that thankfully in the past, 5 to 8 years, we've seen more literature about it. As we talked about last episode, city of Alexandria became a center for contrabands. It was one of the first and closest kind of Union enclaves in Virginia. Virginia had the largest amount of enslaved people when we had the 1861 and 62 Confiscation Acts, and then, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation. Many of these enslaved people are going to run towards freedom, which is across Union lines. So we're going to get about 7 to 8,000 contraband within the first few years. And of course, there's going to be medical issues, disease, malnourishment in general, just neglect from slavery. Now, Dr. Bentley, our fan favorite over here, he will take it upon himself to be involved in the contraband medical care. That was not part of his initial duties, but he will visit these hospitals. We're going to see specific centers created just for contraband. They are not allowed to be treated in the regular hospitals, I want to say. So we're going to see hospitals like Louverture, Claremont originally was a contraband hospital, and then the contraband hospital in school. So these became specific sites for African Americans. Now, these will be founded like in 1864. Okay, so for the first couple of years, there's no dedicated medical center for them. Major Bentley, he's going to collaborate with some citizen activists like Harriet Jacobs, who was a formerly enslaved woman. She had fled slavery prior to the war. And then Julia Wilbur, she's a white abolitionist from Rochester, New York. And they're going to come down and basically help advocate for their treatment. Prior to Bentley's kind of intervention, kind of like we discussed last episode, there's no resources or funding. In the budget for the military government, they have the smallest slice of that pie. And so a lot of the funding for these hospitals, the allocation of supplies will come from private citizens, benevolent societies. Um, and there's a great story that I am saving for our last episode on burials and the reclamation of Alexandria. And it has to do with burying United States colored troops in the National Cemetery. And I'm saving it, I'm teasing it because Dr. Bentley had a major role in ensuring that USCT troops get a military burial rather than a civilian burial. Yeah.
Oh, exciting. And
Mhm.
you've made me want to go and watch Mercy Street again now.
Oh my gosh, Mercy Street,
I love that TV show.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Again, people have asked me a lot, and I think you've probably asked me too, but I'll say it again. Does a very great job. Of course, there's a lot of dramatizations, a lot of just like drama for no reason. But I like how Mercy Street addresses not just the soldiers, but also the contraband population. They do a very good job of that. And again, that Mansion House Hospital is spotlighted. Those historical figures did exist. All the people, Dr. Foster, Mary the nurse, um, Frank Stringfellow, Emma Green, they're all real people. And so I highly encourage our viewers here to go watch PBS's Mercy Street. It has 3 seasons. You can binge watch it in a day.
Oh yeah, no,
Yeah.
and I thought it was only two, but yeah, um,
Oh, two? Yeah. Oh
yeah,
yeah, probably has two. Yeah.
yeah, because I was always like upset that they never
Yeah, that's
made
right.
another one,
Hopeful for that
because
third
I really
season.
enjoyed it. And what I liked as well is they added the story of the female soldier
Yes.
into to one of the episodes, which
Hmm.
has always fascinated me as a topic that people forget there were so many women that
Yes.
again not just the American Civil
Right.
War but the Rev War and loads of wars
Oh
where they
yeah.
said, you know what, why can't I go and fight for my country? Of course they
Yep.
disguise themselves, and again I think that I can't remember the episode exactly how it goes, but
Hmm.
of course she's still just hiding as a man. And then, of course, when
Yeah.
they start operating, they realize this is a woman, this is not a man,
Yeah. We
which
have
probably happened on
examples.
the
Yeah.
battlefield quite a lot too.
It
But
did.
I just thought adding that
Yes.
aspect to the story was fantastic. But
Yes.
great series. Go and watch it, guys. I'm definitely going to go and watch it later. Um, but Madeline, thank you so much again. It's been absolutely fantastic. Now, what I will say, ladies and gentlemen, please go and check out Rooted in Place, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. And all that is left to say, Madeline, is thank you again and cheers.
Thanks for having me. Cheers.